Okay, let's move on to the next one. We brought you about the news last week of Canada celebrating a literal Nazi in the parliament. This led to the resignation of the Canadian speaker. Prime Minister Trudeau had to apologize to the Canadian people. For the background, it was when Zelensky was appearing before parliament and they honored a quote unquote Ukrainian freedom fighter who was in his late 90s. They failed to mention that the so called freedom fighter was a member of the Waffen SS who volunteered and whose unit was implicated in multiple war crimes that have been verified. We don't know if he has. The Polish government has since actually indicated they may seek to extradite him, just to give you a little bit of an idea. This, though, has set off a really fun discourse about, well, can't we sympathize with these Ukrainians? They were, stuck in an awful position because they've been conquered by the Soviets, and then the Nazis came in, and the whole enemy of my enemy is my friend. At a conceptual level, maybe. But we're not talking about a Wehrmacht soldier. We're talking about a straight up volunteer for the Waffen SS sworn guard of Hitlerism. Let's put this up there on the screen just to give you a little bit of a taste of what some of this apologia looks like. This is from Politico. Quote, "A lie can make it halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. The ongoing turmoil over the parliament, recognizing the former trooper, highlights one of the most important reasons why." And the headline is fighting against the USSR didn't necessarily make you a Nazi. And yet, as they actually quote here from the Nuremberg Tribunal, quote, "The tribunal declares to be criminal within the meaning of the charter those persons who had been officially accepted as members of the SS." And again, this person was explicitly implicated in massacres, this unit that occurred in either Ukraine, Poland, I forget. The borders have moved since all of this has happened. And I think, I was talking to Yegor about this.
Yeah.
I don't understand this like Nazi revisionism. There are heroic Ukrainian fighters who fought on the side of the Soviet Union against the tide of Nazism and who still were not like sworn allies of Stalin.
They were still Ukrainian
They were
nationalists.
still Ukrainian nationalists who fought valiantly and bravely. Some of the worst battles on the Eastern Front occurred on current Ukrainian soil. Horrific slaughter. I mean, hundreds and millions of people who were killed there. And many of them were Ukrainian soldiers, yes, who were caught in a tough spot. But don't forget this, after this whole like fairy tale idea of like, oh, well, we only fought for the Nazis because they were fighting against Stalin. In many cases, the Nazis would come in and they would hang half the people in the streets.
Right.
And then they would also be like, hey, tell us where all the Jews are. Unfortunately, a lot of people, were complicit within that. And it has led to this really bizarre moment where we're trying to like whitewash history and make it so that actually the Soviets were the real enemy. Now, I'm not going to glorify the freaking Soviet Union. I did a whole monologue about Stalin's murderous invasion of Finland yesterday. But just to give people a taste, this is the highest levels of government. This is from Secretary Antony Blinken, our Secretary of State. Here's what he tweets. He tweets, 82 years ago, Nazis murdered 34,000 Jews at Babin Yar. Soviets buried the history, which today Putin's government manipulates to cover for Russia's abuses in Ukraine. The U.S. is committed to justice for Holocaust survivors and accountability. And as a very basic fact check that is added to there, it's Soviet prisoners of war who were among the people who were massacred at Babin Yar. The Soviets actually liberated Babin Yar and Kyiv in 1943. Quote, the Soviets held a trial in 1946 in Kyiv for 15 German policemen who were involved in said massacre. This is not Soviet glorification. They did plenty of horrible things. In many respects, they are responsible for just as many, if not more deaths. And we can talk about that all day long. But why do we have to do this like jujitsu of the mind to be like, no, they were actually the enemy at that time. We're going to outright, blame the Soviets for something that they didn't even do at the time and then tie it to Putinism. The invasion of Ukraine is enough. The current invasion, it's
Right.
horrible. It's like, why are we doing this revisionism? And honestly, like, it is the strangest, tide that I have seen in recent days. And I think all of it comes back to, if we have to talk about Nazism in Ukraine, you just seem like you're a Putin ally. And it doesn't make you a Putin ally to say, yeah, there's a neo-Nazi problem inside of Ukraine. Does it validate all of the Russian criticisms of Ukraine? No. Does it mean all Ukrainians are Nazi? Absolutely not. But yeah, it exists. It's an issue. It just means that the conflict is a gray zone, like it is in almost every conflict that's ever happened in all of human history.
The Secretary Blinken one, first of all, I genuinely don't understand why people are feeling the need to do this.
I mean,
like the Politico Europe piece that's like, well, it's not necessarily a Nazi. It's like, this thing is already over. The prime minister already apologized.
Yep.
Like the speaker of the parliament already stepped down. Like Jewish groups were enraged. Yeah. Why are you going back to this? You lost this one.
Right.
Why? Why are you doing this? You don't have to do this. It's over. Okay. The Secretary Blinken one, it doesn't even on its face make sense. Because he's like, on the one hand, he says Soviets buried this history.
Right.
And on the other hand, he says Putin's government is manipulating this history to provide cover for Russia's abuses in Ukraine. Which is it? Did they bury it? Are they using it?
Yes.
Are they manipulating it? Is it probably like what? It doesn't even literally make sense on its face. And so it goes back to this very Disneyfied, black and white view of the world, view of this conflict where they're the bad guys, and now we got to rewrite all of history to make sure that they were always the bad guys, and they're always going to be the bad guys. And if Putin's trying to use World War II history to glorify them and justify his invasion, well, we're going to change our minds about what happened with the Nazis, and we're going to be completely different. Yep. And we're going to try to revive these historic Ukrainian nationalist freedom fighters who signed up to be Nazis. I mean, let's be clear about this. If you were in the Waffen-SS, you had to swear allegiance to Hitler and the Nazi Party. You were a Nazi. Like, it is not complicated. You don't need to go back and be like, well, really, maybe they weren't necessary. No, they were literally a Nazi, okay? Now, there may be gradations of the atrocities they commit or whatever. We don't know what this man did in his life, but you don't need to glorify him in Parliament, and you don't need to justify glorifying him in Parliament.
No, and that's the problem, is they tried to make it conceptual. They're actually not wrong. And so I will say it. There are some people who were in the Waffen-SS. I'm not, justifying or excusing their behavior, but who did not participate in atrocities. They were probably more akin to like elite Wehrmacht troops, and in many respects, did fight very bravely on the Eastern Front. But that doesn't erase the reason that they joined, and just because they were deployed in that way doesn't mean that they couldn't have easily been deployed to a death camp. And in many cases, they actually did both. So it's just, again, history does not smile kindly on this, considering especially what happened with Nuremberg.
Can I also just say, and maybe you can help me illuminate the history on this Saagar.
Yeah.
Did they really delude themselves into thinking Hitler was going to give them their freedom and their independent state? I mean, that seems really wild to me.
Well, in the initial months, it wasn't a crazy idea. So in the initial months, a lot of Ukrainians don't want to talk about this, but like in Kyiv and in some of the places that Hitler rolled through, they had signs being like, "Welcome, we glorify Hitler." Like they had actual swastikas that were up. Again, I mean, it's actually Hitler's stupidity and the German army's idiocy, where they didn't cast themselves as an army of liberation, and instead they embraced like full-scale slaughter.
Conquest.
Their plan in the East was depopulation. They had this, I forget what the name of it was called, but it was effectively what they gave an order where they're like, all food is for German troops. They're like, food is not a priority for Soviet prisoners of war and for Soviet residents. Effectively, famine, starve them out, and to kill them. The best book I've ever read on this subject is called Stalin's War. It's actually a recent book, quote, A New History of World War II by a guy named Sean McKeegan. It's a very, very provocative book. It is still the best book I've ever read on the subject. I did the monologue yesterday about the Winter War. That's where I learned a lot of the, colored in details. I mean, even yesterday I talked about the Winter War. Here's, I didn't have the time to go into a lot of it. I mean, even the Finnish history is complicated because after that peace deal I talked about, well, they signed a deal with the Nazis, and they actually worked with the Nazis to invade the Soviet Union. It's called the Continuation War. And, they basically were like, look, we're willing to fight with whomever they want. But the part of their history that they glorify is not that. They glorify, we fought always for Finnish independence. That was like the point that I was trying to make in that monologue. It's just interesting, though, because within all of this and all of this historical revisionism, it's really like 1984-esque of like Oceania has always been at war with East Asia. We're like, no, like Russia is bad now, which means it's been bad for all time. It's like, well, we were actually allies at the time. We were, who do you think was funding the Soviet military? It was us. This is the only reason that they were able to succeed in the first place. They would never have won Stalingrad or any of their major battles if it wasn't for Lend-Lease and the tremendous amount of military and economic aid that we were able to provide for them. So I don't know. I think all of this is very bizarre. I think it comes back to exactly what you said, is we just love, the Disney version is just easier. We invaded on D-Day and we killed Hitler. And that was it.
And it's always been so.
90% of the casualties were on the Eastern Front. We have no idea what happened over there. It also leads to this revisionism too about corruption, just to give you an idea too of like, okay, if we're finally allowed to talk about Nazis in Ukraine, put this up there. Just yesterday, Politico got its hands on, quote, leaked U.S. strategy that sees Ukraine as a massive corruption as a massive threat inside. But really what troubled me, obviously, it's not, it's no joke that corruption is a problem. It's that Biden decided not to raise it for the first year of the war when they were getting the vast majority of the support because he thought it would validate critics of the war in Ukraine. And honestly, what's even creepier is inside of this 21-page memo is a straight up Afghan era like an Afghan era nation building plan. They're like, here's our recommendation for how you need to redo your military. Here's our recommendation for how you redo your banking sector and your energy sector. I'm like, when did we sign up for this? I thought we were shipping them weapons.
Yes.
But as I did my monologue about, no, man, we're paying their small businesses. We're paying their emergency responders. We're bankrolling their entire civil society. This is Afghanistan 2.0. The U.S. military does not know how to do war without nation building. And that's what we're signing up for in Ukraine right now.
Not only that, I mean, there were some real red flags here in terms of their view of how you eliminate corruption is basically like market radical neoliberalism.
Right, yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, everything was like, oh, the problem in the banking sector, better make it privatized because Lord knows there's no corruption in our banking sector with it being privatized. So one of their envisioned milestones, they say, is that Alpha Bank is transparently returned to private ownership because it was an institution now known as Sansa Bank. It was previously Russian-owned, now nationalized by Ukraine. Got to privatize everything to root out the corruption because that's certainly been the secret solution to all of our problems here. So there were some major red flags here. There's number one, the fact this was hidden. There was a public version of the report that was much more sort of like high level and sanitized. This was the private version that Politico was able to get their hands on. The number of industries that we had a lot of opinions about was quite extraordinary. And then the suggestions themselves also were, fit a playbook that we've been rolling out around the world for quite a long time.
Yeah, ask Afghanistan how it worked out. We try and take one of the most corrupt nations on earth, of which Ukraine was before the war. This is an indisputable fact. And how it worked out for us, taxpayer dollars, our effort, and even for the Afghan people, for all of those so-called efforts. It didn't work out so well. But we simply do not know how to operate without running that playbook. Anyway, just wanted to give people a new. It's insane, really, to see this level of revisionism. But honestly, it is a good view into the elite mind of like, okay, Russia bad. That means Russia always been bad, and that means we have to go retroactively, basically lie about stuff from 80 years, 75 years ago. It's just craziness. It's absolute madness, but that is the absolute state of where we are with the Ukraine discourse today.
It is pretty wild. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.